This is House Planning Help, episode 374. Hello, I'm Ben Adam Smith, and this is the podcast for you if you're interested in building new or retrofitting an existing dwelling. I'm exploring what houses we should be building in the 21st century and trying to break down the major roadblocks that may get in our way. Coming up in this session, my guest is Mike Eliason, the founder and principal of Larch Lab. He's a researcher, writer, urbanist and architect based in Seattle. He's also the author of a new book called Building for People, Designing Livable, Affordable, Low-Carbon Communities. Yes, this is right up our street, so we're going to dig into it today and highlight some of the important lessons. So there's a lot of value in this conversation coming up, but it has made me think we really do need more interviewees from around the world. We've had a few recently. We had Tilman Kramulisch from Nature Plus in Germany, Lloyd Alter, he's always good value from Canada, Amelia Lee, the undercover architect in Australia. And yes, we are a British podcast, but part of the reason that we have so many guests from the UK, I suppose, is because I'm a bit closer to them. I know that they've got good stuff, or I've visited their buildings. That is certainly easier for me when we share a case study podcast. So if there's someone you think would be good, particularly if the knowledge they share is something that applies all around the world, for example, talking about regulation in a specific country, it's likely to be different everywhere, whereas physics doesn't change wherever you are in the world. So that idea. And different topics, we're always looking to explore the new or to drill down in more detail on one specific part of the process, because we've been around the block a few times on this podcast. So if you can help, if you've got some ideas, chat to me on social media or get onto our website, houseplanninghelp.com, and click on the contact pages. It'd be lovely to hear what you're thinking. So let's get to our featured interview with Mike Eliason from Larch Lab, author of Building for People. And I suppose, yes, it's primarily a book to convince the powers that be that we can be doing a much better job. So he lays it all out and we can see some of those important concepts and how they all fit together. That's what he's done really well. What's interesting is a lot of what he has to say is because of the contrast between the USA and Germany, where he spent quite a bit of time. So I started by asking Mike how and when he first ended up there.
So I was actually still at university. I was at Virginia Tech, and the fourth year of the program there, they kind of kick everybody out. There's a residency program you can go to in Riva San Vitale, Switzerland. There's a study abroad, or there's a travel program that typically travels through Europe for about a semester, a little bit less than a semester. You can go work for a firm for credit. So a colleague of mine who had been dating a German woman who was from the city of Freiburg and who's had some kind of connection with this firm when I was trying to figure out where I was going to go, because I wanted to go work abroad. And the study abroad program is really expensive, and the travel abroad program was also really expensive. And so like the idea of working for a firm and getting paid to live in Europe sounded way more exciting and fascinating. And so originally I was looking for a firm in Berlin for about a semester, maybe 6 months. And so my colleague, whose fiance, now wife, was from Freiburg, was like, look, if you send me your resume, your CV, I'll ship it off to the firm and maybe they'll hire you for a year. That's way better than 6 months. And so I tried to translate my resume and portfolio into German as quickly and easily as I could. They pretty much hired me and another student who had just graduated on site. And so I spent an entire year working in the middle of Freiburg on a wide variety of projects, detached houses, multifamily housing, some public work, some laboratory work. And Freiburg at that time had a massive pedestrian zone, which is where I lived and was fortunate enough to work. Quietest place I've ever lived, for that matter. And the work that was going on at that time, I think I was moderately aware of it, but I wasn't, fully absorbing it to the degree that, today I wish I had. So like the district of Vauban, which has a lot of self-build multifamily housing, Baugruppen, was well underway. They have mass timber and passive house projects there. Same for the district of Rieselfeld. And all of these things were kind of happening simultaneous with my time there. But like I was young, I was a student, so it's kind of like work all day, hang out with people all night. Somehow like all of these things, I knew they were there. They were all kind of latent. And over time, a lot of these memories, and I would go back and do research on things, they all kind of came to the forefront. So in a lot of ways, Freiburg and working that year in Germany was really, really foundational, not just to my career, but I met my wife there. She's not German, she's from California. So my entire career and life is really just resulting from that 1 year working abroad.
When you completed that year, did you have a sense of, I want to bring some of these ideas back to the US?
I did. I still had to come back and finish my final year at university. And then when I had completed that, the woman I met, Heather, who is now my wife, after I graduated, was like, look, I want to go to grad school now. These are the cities we're looking at. And of the ones, Seattle seemed the most, it had like a good relationship, like topography, climate, sense of place, and building with wood that I was exposed to in Baden-Württemberg in Germany. And so we settled here. And I want to say it was like on and off for 5, 6, 7, 8 years, just mostly talking about mass timber. Like I didn't really know about Passive House at that time, even though the firm I had worked for was doing a lot of innovative low energy stuff. And everyone was just like, there's no need for this. Nobody understands what mass timber is. Just sounds really interesting, but we would never do it. And then fast forward a decade later, we have the first cross-laminated timber conference in Seattle. A couple years later, mass timber gets adopted into the building code. And now everyone's talking about mass timber. So for me, it's like really funny to have been so close to all of these things, like 20 years really before it became mainstream in the US.
And in Building for People, your book, you're quite scathing of housing in the United States. So why is it not fit for purpose?
I would say it's a couple things. One, the way we develop housing in the US is kind of an anomaly from the rest of the world, with the exception of Canada. A big part of that is just kind of the generalized layout. So multifamily housing in the US, for a number of reasons. We have really high construction costs. We build with different materials. We have different regulations. But our building costs, our financing regimes, our land use codes all kind of induce, when you combine them, these really, really large buildings. And so we don't really have this breadth of multifamily housing between like the row house or the townhouse and like the big multifamily apartment building. And so there's this huge kind of bifurcated nature where multifamily housing in the US is in units that I would say are relatively substandard. In a lot of cases, it's basically like living in a hotel. You'll have a corridor down the middle of a building, units on one side, units on the other. Those units will be really, really deep. If you're fortunate and live on the corner, you could get daylight on two sides. But for the most part, they're going to be studios and one-bedroom units. You're going to have one window at the end of your unit, kind of like living in a bowling alley. And it's really difficult to get the economics of larger units in these kinds of buildings. So if you're a family, it can be even more difficult to find housing. For a number of reasons, these buildings end up resulting in significantly larger units than you would find in Europe. So like 1,000 square foot, what is that? 100 square meter plus or minus unit in Europe, for the most part, could be like a 3-bedroom unit. In most of the US and new construction, that's going to be a 2-bedroom unit. They won't really be able to squeeze in a third unit. If it does, it won't have a window. A lot of times they'll really be designed for roommates rather than families. So it would be 2 units, both with like an ensuite kind of condition, walk-in closets, right? The architects and the developer have to fill in all that space with something. And so the quality of those units is not really great. They're not affordable, in part because they're so much larger. They're not climate adaptive. So in 2021, we had the heat dome here in Washington State. It was a almost week-long heat event where we had to deal with extreme high temperatures, both day and nighttime. I think we exceeded our nighttime high in recorded history ever. There were about 12 to 1,400 people who unfortunately succumbed to that heat between Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia and Canada. And it was really kind of eye-opening to me that the way that we were designing our housing, you could not open your windows and get any kind of cross ventilation or breeze if you were facing south or west. We don't do any kind of solar protection for the most part in our multifamily buildings or any buildings in the US. And so you would be baking. I had colleagues and friends who sent me photographs of their units that were 90 degrees Fahrenheit at night. That was like the low in the temperature. And they would just be baking during the day. And so just thinking about like how housing can be community oriented, how housing can be a place of resilience, and hopefully you can adapt to the changing events of climate change, how a home can be comfortable and protective. I really feel like the way that we're kind of developing in the US is really antithetical to any of those themes. And so a big part of the book and what I do as an architect and advocate is like highlight what those differences are and why the outcomes are so different and what they do in other places that offers a radically different way to us, not to them, like people living in Switzerland or Austria or Germany or France or whatever, but a radically different way for us to really think about housing.
Now, why have you written this book now?
So that's a really good question. I am involved in a lot of advocacy around housing, around land use, around transit-oriented development in eco districts. But the big one is point access blocks or single stair buildings. In the UK, you guys have an extensive history with single stair buildings. You also have a couple of events that have resulted in the UK lowering the number of floors that can be accessible by a single stair. In the US, we're generally limited to 3 floors on a single stair, and then there are further limitations, like you can only have a handful of units. Where I live in Seattle, we can go up to 6 floors. And New York City can also go to 6 floors. Hawaii, I believe Oahu or Honolulu can also go to 6 floors. So there's a little bit of variation, but what I was noticing is that on smaller scale development, we have the opportunity to do things that are very different from the status quo of multifamily housing anywhere, and much closer aligned to kind of the things that I lived in and worked on when I was working in Germany. And through this advocacy, I've become connected with a broad network of other advocates and politicians. And so a number of people reached out and were like, hey, we can't really advocate for a lot of these things, like, Baugruppen or point access blocks, without having more tangible things that we can take to a politician or to a fire department or a city official and say, look, this is what it can look like. This is how things are different. And so there was a lot of pressure, not just pressure, but there was a lot of desire for some kind of document that wasn't just a report, because I had worked on a couple of reports and other folks had worked on reports as well, but something that was a little bit more formalized. And so part of it was just elevating kind of the voice of advocacy around housing and stairs, but also just we have a ton of transit infrastructure going in around Seattle. We're redeveloping station areas, but we're not doing it in a way that has a lot of open space, that has a lot of affordable housing, that has places that will be able to mitigate the urban heat island effect or even deal with like the deluges from storms. And so for me, it became part of this broader discussion of like how we develop and redevelop in the US really needs a fundamental rethink to kind of prioritize, all of these other things, public health, community, affordability, and sustainability in ways that I think haven't really been synthesized to the degree this book is attempting to do. And so really that was the main driver of it.
Some good news and bad news for you. The bad news is I think you're facing an uphill struggle, as you may well be telling me in a second. The good news is I think you've absolutely nailed it with the book. I don't think I've read a book that has got so much of what is important all wrapped together. So my question, I suppose, is how did you lay it out, and how did you decide what was important and dedicate the right amount to each section?
Oh, that's a really good one too. So thank you very much for stating that. Everyone that I've talked to that's read the book has said that it's really kind of opened up their, not just their eyes, but a big part of it is the vocabulary, right? The lexicon about how we talk about buildings and housing in the US is really stunted. For me, it was really just kind of, I started pulling together all of these concepts that I felt would make kind of the ideal eco district or even the ideal development, and trying to weave them in a way that made a little bit of sense, right? So there's like a section dedicated to how we build, so low carbon building. There's a section dedicated to nature and open space. There's a section dedicated to the design of eco districts, human-centered places. And so really it was just kind of pulling all of these things that in a lot of senses I was already writing about to some degree or researching, and then trying to fit them in a way that made a little bit of sense. It definitely is an uphill battle here. And to be honest, there are definitely days where it's just like, I'm ready to throw in the towel. I might as well move back to Germany, where these things are already standard. I don't have to have the organizational fights or advocacy efforts to, find a path for these things. But at the same time, like there's a really massive opportunity to creating better places it's not really a massive change to how we do things. It's just being more intentional and thoughtful and maybe just precise in how we do things.
I don't know whether you're going to resonate with this, but there was a side of looking at this thinking that you're living in a fairy tale land here. This is never going to happen. And then the flip side of everything that you've got here is absolutely practical. And you look at German common sense and it's already happening.
No, very much so, right? The biggest struggle I had in the book, and it really came around issues around diagrams and photographs. Initially, when I was laying the book out and pitched it to the publisher, Island Press, I was really thinking it would be more renderings. Like I wanted it to be aspirational. This is what it could look like, or, to not really plant a seed of like, this is what it has to look like, but to leave it a little bit diaphanous so that the reader could kind of bring their own thoughts and would like see a sketch drawing and be like, oh, okay, it could be something like this, but it doesn't have to be. But in the end, it ended up being probably 60%, 70% actual districts and spaces and places and 30% renderings. But there's this duality that occurs where it opens up people's minds to it doesn't have to be just this rigid thing, right? And it doesn't have to be an entire district. A lot of these concepts are readily pulled into just one development. It doesn't have to be for this huge brownfield. It could be for this smaller building, but incorporate a lot of the same concepts and ideas.
So did I see that you were trying to do your collective housing somewhere around Seattle and that it had been hard work? Could you fill us in there?
Yeah, so we've been talking about and trying to figure out how to do bow grouping here in Seattle for a number of years, on and off. The group has kind of waxed and waned. It's a number of difficulties right now. Construction costs are really high. Interest rates are really high, which just makes everything else difficult. Our land use codes really aren't optimized, and the entitlement process isn't really optimized to make self-development, self-build, whether at the single-family scale or the multifamily scale, readily feasible, when I think that it could be. It's an ongoing process. A big part of it is just access to capital and development, especially where we live, is crucial. And so trying to do a lot of the work on our end on the front end has been a little bit limiting. It's been a lot more challenging. It's taken a lot longer. I think we're starting to figure out what it is and how it will be, but we're still a couple of years from even breaking ground on something.
Well, I wish you the best of luck with it. I wanted to look at some of the key themes in the book. So shall we start? What is an eco-district?
So an eco-district is a place where ecology and affordability and community are all kind of central themes to a place. A lot of times these will end up being in brownfields. If you are familiar with Vauban in Freiburg, this was a former military base that was converted into a neighborhood of mostly 4- or 5-story buildings, about half of them market rate, and then half of them cooperatives or self-build multifamily housing. It's a place where you don't have to do driving for your daily chores, right? Like you eat breakfast, you walk down the stairs, you can walk your child to school, or maybe they can walk themselves. Oftentimes, these are being designed in ways that kids don't even have to interact with cars. If there are streets, generally they're low traffic, low stress, very bikeable, very walkable kind of places. They also prioritize open space and green space to a greater degree than we see around dense transit-oriented development, TOD, in the US. And I think that there's a fundamental difference in the way that we do district scale housing in the US versus other places, where we don't mandate certain levels of affordability. Often in Europe, they'll have really high levels of affordability, right? These are places where they're already investing in transit. Oftentimes it's public land, or if it's a private developer, the city is rezoning it. So the developer is going to make a lot of money, and the city can be like, look, we're going to rezone this industrial land to residential or mixed use, but you're going to have to reserve a quarter of it for affordable housing or social housing. You don't have to build it. You just have to provide the land. And so there are mechanisms that other cities and countries have to induce more affordability around these places, so you have a really good social and economic mix. In the US, we're not really good about that. And so oftentimes you'll have a token affordable housing project or two, and then it's mostly market rate buildings. Our buildings are thicker than in Europe. It's the floor plate itself. And so there's less open space. There's less space for community. If you're doing a courtyard in the US, it's significantly smaller than you would find in like Europe or Switzerland or even in the UK. And so it's really about developing places where people can thrive and live a low carbon lifestyle.
And I know you mentioned this term, I think it was a rental house syndicate. Is that the same as a community land trust that we have in the UK? So you're putting a piece of land into trust for the benefit of the people, and you're not going to make a profit on it.
It's a similar concept. So the Miethäuser Syndicate, the rental house syndicate, which is another entity that came out of Freiburg at about the same time I was living there. What they'll do is this is umbrella organization that will effectively co-buy property, multifamily property with the tenants and own it in common. And the way that it's structured is the building can't be sold without everyone coming to an agreement, because it's effectively a 51-49% ownership ratio. It's managed by the residents. There's a solidarity fund that residents put in to kind of help grow the organization so that the organization can help other entities develop projects. What's really fascinating to me is that the Mietshäuser Syndicate isn't just working on helping renters buy existing buildings, they're also developing new projects. So there's this really wonderful student dormitory that they're building. It was planned and managed and will be maintained by the residents who are living in it. It's mass timber, it's passive house, it's affordable. It's kind of a fundamentally different way of thinking about how we can live together and do so in a way that fosters community, that helps solve the social isolation crisis, that can address the climate crisis, and just offers places that are affordable in perpetuity.
So we've mentioned that this is almost a tough sell if we were going to try and wave a magic wand and do everywhere overnight. So when we get these examples, how do we use them to their maximum potential to try and encourage it to happen somewhere else?
Oh, so this is a really good question. And in the passive house community, especially in North America, I feel like this is a really good example. We talked about passive house for years and years and years. And until we had like a tangible model of a passive house project that we could take like politicians and architects and developers and clients to and say, look, this is why this is like so much better than the status quo. A lot of people really didn't get it. And it was the same with mass timber. I talked about mass timber until I was blue in the face, but it wasn't until there were projects that were built in British Columbia where people could actually fundamentally see how different this way of building and what the quality of life and the quality of the light and all these other things in these places were. So I think having the ability to test things out and build prototypes, whether it's a mass timber building or a passive house building or a community land trust in your neighborhood, I think is really an ideal way of building some of this support. But there are so many different models where things are succeeding in ways that we can't even, especially in the US, we can't even imagine because like we don't have the wherewithal to think about something because of this bifurcated nature, right? Where we have small apartment in a big building or like a detached house or a row house or townhouse, and there's nothing in between, right? Like we can't even have some of these conversations because just literally the words used to describe something are just not present in our lexicon.
Yeah, it's tricky, isn't it? And, what do you see as the role for, say, regulation wherever we are in the world? What should the regulation side of things be?
The issue of regulation is funny because it's not something I ever thought I'd really be paying attention to other than like, okay, here's a rule, we have to follow it. But then like becoming involved in advocacy around passive house, around point access blocks, around mass timber, kind of came to the realization that regulation is kind of a double-edged sword, right? Like you can have regulations that incentivize or induce something, and you could also have regulations that exclude something or prevent something. And as an example here in the US, we have single-family zoning. It's just residential zoning where only detached houses are allowed, and it makes up the overwhelming land of almost every single city in the US, I think with the exception of New York City. So here in Seattle, it's about 75% of the city's land area is dedicated to effectively sprawl, right? And so there's not a really good way of inducing multifamily housing in this historically because it's just illegal. Whereas you could have regulation like the city of Brussels had around passive house, where everything after a certain date has to meet passive house. And in the run up to that date, well, we'll incentivize passive house buildings, we'll assist with trainings, we'll promote projects. Regulation is this funny thing where it's like you can have regulations that say, no, you can't do that. But I think that there are also ways to formulate regulations to allow for more creativity or to induce more creativity. Another interesting example, France has a 50% biomaterials mandate for new construction. And so it's fostering this ecosystem where you have more mass timber buildings that are going up. You have more straw buildings and retrofits using like eco-cocoon straw panels going up than you would have even a couple of years ago. And so I think it's really good to have creativity and the possibility for creativity, because if we're just kind of pumping out the same thing over and over again, it isn't necessarily the greatest thing. And okay, we know how to do it and we can maybe do it well, but it might not be the right thing for somebody else, right? Like we need places that offer more variability, or just thinking about how we design a house, right? Is that house only designed for a nuclear family, or could it be for a multi-generational family? Like allowing places that have more flexibility, I think in the long run is good.
At one point in the book, you say multi-family housing in the United States is far inferior to single-family housing, or at least that's the perception of it. So why is that?
To get to the kind of the why I wrote that statement, right? Let's say you're living in a detached house, one story ranch, you have daylight on four sides, you have windows on four sides, you've got a yard to play in. We don't really have an ecosystem of multifamily housing that offers a comparable way of living as you did in a detached house. And so for me, as like someone who's a dad, we have two kids. Our kids, when they were growing up, needed places to play outside. If we were to go look for multifamily housing that we could live in, so like a 3-bedroom, it was going to be a massive unit, 1,400, 1,500 square feet, which is almost double what we live in right now. It wouldn't have a yard. There wouldn't be a lot of open space. It would be incredibly expensive. We probably couldn't have afforded it anyway. And so fundamentally, we need to be rethinking about how our cities can provide space for families, that can provide space where single parents are comfortable living in a building, and a hotel-like building with like 50 units on a floor might not be the best place to raise a kid. And so it's part about rethinking the way we develop. It's also about rethinking our land use regulations. And a big fundamental disconnect is that our land use regulations and our building regulations aren't really optimized to get the best out of either. One example for this is in the US, going from single family housing to multifamily housing is a huge jump in cost. It's really, really expensive. But in other countries, and Stephen Smith at the Center for Building in North America has been doing a lot of research on this. Like in Germany, that single family house on a per square foot basis is like the most expensive form of development. When you start doing low rise and multifamily buildings, those costs come down pretty significantly. It's the same in even Spain or Italy. Part of it is just the way that we're building is radically driving up the cost of multifamily housing. And so if we want to address affordability and making cities places where people can live in perpetuity and thrive, then we need to really change the kind of paradigm around that.
And do you think that one of the big challenges that a lot of countries face is just the money that's in construction? So much of the time it's about how can we cut a few corners and maximize that profit?
Yeah, and I think there are some solutions that are a really good work around that. Self-build. The Netherlands does a lot of, they'll do like little districts of self-build housing where they'll reconfigure all of the infrastructure for an urban block, and then they'll parcelize it into, 15, 20, 30 different lots where a self-build person can come in. They pay the connection fee, which the city, because they're doing a lot of the infrastructure and management of that, is relatively low compared to like market rate construction, because they're just trying to get their costs back. They're not trying to make a profit on that. And so you'll get this place where, you have 20, 30 buildings. They're all built by different people. They're all designed by different people. Maybe the massings are all kind of similar, but they can look wildly different. And you know what? Those self-build neighborhoods are amazing. They're incredible. Like we should be doing more of that in the US. There are other ways to induce more affordability. Community land trusts, I'm a huge fan of. Cooperatives, the Swiss model of cooperatives, where it's a cost-based rent, has induced some of the most fascinating and innovative housing that I've ever seen in the entire world. The Swiss regulations around housing, I think, are also have a much lighter touch than you would find in North America. The Baugruppen model is kind of like a hybrid between market rate development and cooperatives, or even social housing. I sit on the board of Seattle's new social housing developer. There's like this whole ecosystem where we could be inducing money into providing housing, but it's not market rate housing, right? Like we could have an ecosystem where we provide housing for everybody, but it doesn't have to be for a for-profit developer. It could be for a non-market developer or some kind of non-speculative housing. And we could scale it up if we had the infrastructure, the development banks, if cities induced it through different offices or mandates or something. So I think that there is a way to get there, but you're right. It's like the question of finance and money on these projects is critical. And I feel like the UK, I've seen some projects, like there's this huge multifamily tower in, I can't remember the city. I want to say Manchester, but I don't think it's Manchester, where like it wasn't built properly. And so they're going to have to tear it down. I feel like luckily we don't have that issue as much in the US, but we don't have a lot of variability. We don't really have a huge public housing sector. We don't have a lot of co-housing. We don't have a lot of co-ops. And so finding the way to grow that ecosystem is going to take a lot of support.
One challenge we all face if we're planning to build a house is expanding our knowledge ahead of the project. So how have you learned? Because you seem to have done a really good job. Is it the university course, the travel, upskilling, being up to date with everything online?
I think it's mostly like 20 years of just constant research and looking at things and just asking fundamental questions. Why does this building only have one stair? And then realizing that there are all of these things that knock on from that. Oh, you could have daylight on two or even three sides. You could have units where you can have cross ventilation. You could have a building with a massive courtyard and your bedrooms are not on the loud side of the building where the street is, right? And so it's a lot of research. For me, it's also working in Germany was really, really eye-opening, not from just the architecture perspective, but just how different quality of life can be, that a pedestrian zone even exists, right? There are a few pedestrianized streets in the US. Like imagine an entire neighborhood that isn't prioritizing the car. It doesn't really exist in much of the US. For me, it's the ability to do a little bit of research in German, working there, kind of connecting all of these loose ends has really what opened the door to the book. But what's really fascinating is that it's also connected me to this larger network of people who are doing advocacy around all kinds of different things. So the single stair aspect of what I have done, the point access block, has been really fascinating. But there was another researcher who realized that the cost of elevators in the US was also substantially higher. So he went and did the research and wrote this 160-page report on why elevator costs in the US are so much more than Switzerland or Spain or even Greece or Italy, and why we have such like low adoption of elevators in the US compared to these other countries. Spain and Greece and Italy all have a much lower GDP than the US, but their elevator uptake is multiple times greater than ours. And so for me, it's really fascinating to see people are kind of realizing that the way we do things is not standard globally. And so maybe synthesizing some of those standards to be more open to what the rest of the world is doing, at least would open up opportunities for different things.
Do you think any of these ideas might act as a catalyst? So, for example, the transport part, if we take the car out of the equation, does everything else naturally fall into place?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is just the way that we plan around cars in the US is not conducive to developing places that are car light and walkable. Like even our transit-oriented development. So like a light rail station or a subway station in a lot of US cities, we don't say, okay, you cannot have more than X amount of cars in this space. And we don't do collated parking for the most part. So buildings have to do their own parking. A lot of times developers will just build parking because they think that's what the market requires. And so you end up with these districts that are very auto-centric, that are not conducive to a place where public health and open space and nature and community are prioritized. You're just constantly inundated by cars coming in and out and in and out. There is some connection between reducing the number of cars and kind of enabling some of these places to be a little bit better. But it's almost like the chicken and the egg, right? Like I think we almost need some developer to come in and say, look, I want to do a district with no cars. And they kind of have to prove that the model of a car light place is possible. We actually are starting to see that in the US. There's a developer, Cul-de-sac, who are in the process of building much larger multifamily development of a much smaller scale. But the entire kind of logic around what they're doing is they're not requiring parking. Places that would have been for parking are now spaces for the community to walk in. They're kind of these pedestrianized streets or alleys, places where cafes can spill out, where you can have community events, just run into your neighbors, right? It's kind of a hearkening back to the way that we used to live before cars just became the overwhelming mode of transportation. If we could find a developer who was like, okay, everything in this book is exactly what I want to do. Let's figure out how to do it. Because like I said, this goes back to the having a model that someone can see, I think is really, really important to getting adoption and spreading kind of the knowledge and gospel about it.
So what exactly are your hopes then for the book?
So the ultimate goal is that the book kind of becomes this catalyst around which people realize that there are better ways of living and developing. And so part of it is getting politicians to realize that the way that things are going right now, I think, is increasingly bleak. And so that there's an opportunity in this moment to not just address better housing, but also climate and social isolation, which are two other big crises that we're not really dealing with well right now, I would say globally. that developers have a sense of other places are doing other things, and maybe whether it's market rate or non-speculative housing, like the outcomes of some of those projects is radically different. And so maybe they'll start to question why their status quo is the way it is, and maybe they'll change things. But also just planners and architects knowing that a different world is possible. And also for advocates, like there are a number of people in the US that are housing adjacent or transportation adjacent. Really a big part of it too is introducing some of these concepts to them so that they can start synthesizing why these things are so disparate here and what can be done at a local or state or national level to start creating some more of these places.
As we start to wrap up, I've got a couple more questions. We're a housing podcast of mainly one-off projects, and we've talked about lots of different aspects through this conversation. What else should we be considering?
Yeah, so I would say understanding what effects climate change is going to have is paramount. So I'm sure you've seen the wildfires here in LA, on the West Coast. The wildfires and smoke are increasingly going to become an issue that we have to deal with. The deluges, the floods, pluvial flooding is not really mapped on a lot of our emergency management maps. And so understanding we shouldn't be building in flooding plains, understanding like how our buildings should be responding to this changing climate, I think is pretty critical. A big one for me is at Larch Lab, Passive House is kind of our baseline, that this is our starting point. And there are a number of reasons why I love Passive House. One is it's comfortable. It's really this nice balance between like high tech and low tech. You could have a house that requires like no heating, or maybe you live in a really mild environment and you don't need heating or cooling. And if you do need heating or cooling, it's usually like the smallest amount possible, right? Like if you go back to Wolfgang Feist and his hairdryer supplies the heating for the house. Thinking about climate change, there's going to be a lot more rain and mold increase associated with climate change. This is another benefit to Passive House. We're building airtight buildings. Mold is de-risked on these buildings to a greater extent than it is in other places. The airtightness of Passive House can help keep out wildfire smoke. If you're in an area that gets extreme heat or extreme cold and you lose energy or power to heat or cool your place, Passive House can increase the passive survivability of those places. And we've seen a couple of studies in the US where code minimum construction and existing construction were habitable in a deep freeze when the power went out for at most half a day. In a lot of instances, it was only a couple of hours, and then pipes started bursting. But that Passive House was relatively warm and habitable for several days, and they could have gone longer. They could have introduced candles or some other means of kind of heating up the place on the inside without having access to energy. Passive House is really kind of the baseline where we start. And then from there, I think there's how we deal with water, how we deal with keeping the sun out of our buildings, right? We don't have a solar protection industry in the US at all. In Germany, every building that I lived in or worked on had operable shades. In the summer, we would keep those closed and it would be relatively comfortable even when temperatures outside were in the high 30s and low 40s. We don't really have the ability to do that here. So the notion that I have to import shades from Germany or Austria because the industry doesn't exist here just kind of blows my mind. But I think that we need to be thinking about how all of these things will affect buildings. And this is an issue whether you live in a bespoke house, a detached house, or even in a multifamily building. All of these things are going to affect people. And so understanding what those changes or effects might be and the most optimal ways to kind of adapt or mitigate those changes is really crucial.
Do you think there's resilience in the group housing, in co-housing, just because you're with other people and you've all got that similar understanding of what's happening?
Yeah, there's a really interesting chapter or subsection of the housing chapter in the IPCC report that came out, I think 2 years ago, where they talk specifically about co-housing and other forms of community-oriented housing, not just because like you know everybody in your building. Oftentimes, if you're designing a building together, you have similar values and things that you're prioritizing in the building, but also just I think it's that day-to-day social connection. When so many people who died in the heat dome event here in the Pacific Northwest were elderly residents who did not have a social network, probably living in much larger buildings. They didn't have people who knew that they were there, who could come in and check on them. So there is this fundamental aspect to like when you develop housing with people you know or people with the same values, and it's a much smaller building. It's not this huge anonymous building with like 200 or 300 units. It's easier to know people, I think, And also, it's just easier to ensure that, okay, if there's a climate event, somebody's going to know something. Maybe you have organizational groups within your self-build group housing. These people are knowledgeable on how we find food in the event of a famine or something. Or, these people know how the building should operate in a heat event or a cold event or something. Like, you start developing these ways of building up that knowledge and experience to hopefully adapt to these kinds of places and changes.
And through all of these different aspects that you explain, do you come to some conclusion or something that ties it together, a message for the whole book?
Oh, man. My message for the book, and I think part of it steals a lot from Rob Hopkins, is that we don't need to reinvent the future, right? That's a big part of my book is these are tangible things. Active solar protection, passive house buildings, low carbon construction, right? All of these things already exist in the world. We can take these things that already exist and reconfigure them, right? We can use our imagination to reconfigure them to the kind of condition, spaces or places that we would like, but we don't have to reinvent the wheel. Like, fundamentally, everything that we need to build low carbon places already exists. We just have to really prioritize them.
With all this common sense, why does it feel so hard? You'd think that every year things get a bit easier, but sometimes it almost feels like the reverse.
I think there's a lot of status quo bias. Things have been this way forever, so why would we change it? But the climate is changing. Our needs as a society are changing pretty dramatically. Our demographics are also changing pretty dramatically. And so developing places that can kind of deal with all of these is really, really critical. And part of that is having the vocabulary to talk about that. Part of it is having the knowledge to know that, this is possible. We just have to do this. They're already doing this in other places. We can prioritize this. Part of it is just the regulations, whether it's around finance or land use or building code or whatever, right, can be tweaked to kind of induce these. And so it's not just any one thing preventing it. It's a whole host of things. But it's really possible to build places that prioritize all of these things and provide shelter and hopefully is moderately affordable so that as a society we can stay connected and stay in community rather than right now everything feels like it's discombobulating everywhere and in not so great a way. And so perhaps it's a way of kind of mitigating some of the banality and the awfulness of the last couple of years, COVID and climate change and all of these other things.
How would you like to wrap this up? You can either repeat a thought from today. I'll mention the book, Building for People. What else would you like to say?
Oh, man. So if you're interested in having me come and talk, this is kind of like my full-time job now is talking about building better places. Ben, I would say you and I have been in communication on and off for like probably 14 or 15 years at this point.
Communication, but not talking. This is one really
social
weird
media,
thing.
Right? Yeah.
Social media. It's funny, isn't it? You've given me a reason to talk to you.
Do you know Nick Grant? Right?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
Yeah, so it was the same thing. Like Nick and I communicated via email and social media for like years and years and years. And then I met him in, I think, Vienna and New York City for passive house events. And so it's just kind of like funny that like we can have these relationships with people that over time actually become physical, tangible relationships. Yeah, there's huge network of people who already know how to do so many of these things. And part of what you've been doing at the podcast, I think, has been really great about talking about different ways of building, different ways of living. The same thing for my book. These networks exist. And so I think finding ways to tap into each other is really crucial to dealing with all of these things that we're going to have to start dealing with.
Well, I wish you best of luck with the book. And I'll repeat again that I think you've done a fantastic job. So, Mike, thank you.
Much appreciated. Thank you very much, Ben.
Get more in our show notes, which today you can find at houseplanninghelp.com/374. We've got a summary for you. We've got a link to where the book is. This is Building for People, Designing Livable, Affordable, Low-Carbon Communities. We'll point you to Mike on social media, to Larch Lab, all within the show notes today. houseplanninghelp.com/374. Would you like more from us? Because we supply it in the form of the Hub, which is our membership community. And the idea being that we want to take the learning further, simplify things for you. So we try and give you the big picture so you can see your overarching journey, be it new build or retrofit, as well as focusing in on the specific areas. Of course, it's always going to be a work in progress, but it's something that we're really passionate about, and we've got different tools, ways of learning, whether it's the courses that take you through step by step, whether it's interacting with other members in the forum, whether it's Ask the Expert. Perhaps you've got specific questions. We've been out filming on different construction sites, always focusing on decisions. You can chat to me during office hour. We've got guests with live trainings. Come and find out more. houseplanninghelp.com/join. Next time, Mike Whitfield is my guest as we look at a day in the life of a builder. Thank you so much for listening. The House Planning Help podcast is produced by Regen Media, content that matters.